He thought he was throwing out a nobody, but he had just humiliated the one woman who could quietly end his career without raising her voice. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. Now, back to Emily Carter. The glass doors of Westbridge Luxury Motors slid open with a soft whisper as Emily stepped inside, the late afternoon sun catching briefly on the polished marble floors beneath her worn sneakers. The showroom stretched wide and immaculate, filled with machines that gleamed under white lights like sculptures rather than cars. Sleek lines of imported steel, leather interiors untouched, each one carrying a price tag that quietly separated dreamers from buyers. Emily paused just a second, her reflection faintly visible in the glass beside a midnight blue coupe, her simple jeans and light sweater standing in quiet contrast to the tailored suits and designer heels drifting through the space. She didn't look lost. She didn't look uncertain. But to the eyes that mattered in that room, she looked invisible. Across the showroom, Mark Reynolds adjusted the cuff of his crisp navy suit, his trained gaze sweeping across the floor the way it always did, measuring, calculating, deciding in seconds who was worth his time. When his eyes landed on Emily, they lingered just long enough for a conclusion to form, and just short enough to feel dismissive. He had seen her type before, or at least he believed he had. Curious visitors, window shoppers, people who came in to dream but not to buy. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like a quiet decision already made. Emily took a few slow steps forward, her eyes tracing the curve of a silver sedan displayed on a raised platform, the kind of car that turned heads without trying. Her fingers brushed lightly along the air beside it, not touching, just measuring distance, as if she already understood its weight, its balance, its purpose. For a moment, no one approached her. Conversations continued around her, soft laughter, the low murmur of negotiations, the clink of coffee, cups from the customer lounge. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, it felt intentional. Finally, Mark moved. Not quickly, not eagerly, but with the deliberate pace of someone who believed he was doing a favor simply by acknowledging her presence. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polished but hollow, his eyes already scanning past her, as if expecting a more suitable customer to appear behind her shoulder. Emily turned to him, her expression calm, her voice soft but steady. "Yes," she said, glancing once more at the silver sedan. "I'd like to learn more about this one." Mark followed her gaze, then let out a short breath through his nose, almost amused. "That model starts at just over 300,000, he said, emphasizing the number slightly, not as information, but as a barrier. Around them, a few heads subtly turned, not enough to be obvious, but enough to feel. Emily nodded once, absorbing the words without reaction, her posture unchanged. "That's fine," she replied quietly. For a fraction of a second, something in her tone didn't match what Mark expected, but he dismissed it just as quickly. Because in his world, appearances weren't just impressions, they were conclusions. And he had already decided who she was. The room didn't know it yet, but that quiet moment, the one where he chose to underestimate her, was the exact moment everything began to shift. Mark tilted his head slightly, as if giving her one last opportunity to correct what he clearly believed was a misunderstanding, his fingers tapping lightly against the glossy surface of a nearby desk in a rhythm that suggested impatience rather than curiosity. And when Emily did not retract her request, when she simply stood there with the same quiet composure, he shifted his weight and let his tone harden just enough to be felt without being openly rude. "That vehicle is part of a limited allocation," he said, his voice carrying a subtle edge now. "We typically reserve detailed viewings for clients who have scheduled in advance," and the words hung in the air like a polite barrier, one that sounded professional on the surface but carried a message that was unmistakably personal beneath it. And Emily noticed it, of course she did. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his body angled just enough to create distance, the unspoken assumption that had already been made about her before she had said more than a single sentence. But she did not react. She did not argue. Instead, she took another small step closer to the car, her gaze steady, her voice still calm. "I understand," she replied, "but I am here now, and I would still like to see it." And for a moment, just a brief flicker, something in Mark's expression hesitated, not because he believed her, but because he was not used to being met with that kind of quiet persistence. Most people either pushed too hard or backed away too quickly, but Emily did neither. She simply remained, grounded, present, unshaken, and that unsettled him more than he expected, though he quickly masked it with a short, dismissive exhale, glancing over his shoulder toward a couple who had just entered the showroom dressed and tailored. Clothing that matched his expectations perfectly, and his attention shifted almost instantly, drawn by what he recognized as opportunity. "If you will excuse me," he said, not waiting for her response. "I need to assist clients with scheduled appointments." And just like that, he stepped away, leaving her standing beside the silver sedan as if she had never been part of the interaction at all. And the room seemed to absorb the moment without acknowledging it. Conversations continued, footsteps echoed softly across the marble, but there was a subtle awareness now, a quiet tension that lingered beneath the surface, because a few people had seen it, the way she had been dismissed, the way she had been measured and found lacking without evidence. And Emily remained where she was for a few seconds longer, her eyes resting on the car one last time, not with longing, not with frustration, but with something far more controlled, as if she were simply taking note, committing details to memory. And then slowly, she turned, her footsteps light against the polished floor as she made her way toward the exit. No raised voice, no confrontation, no visible emotion beyond the calm she had carried in with her. And as the glass doors slid open once again, the late afternoon lights spilling across the floor in long reflections, she paused just briefly at the threshold, her hand resting against the cool metal frame, and in that stillness, there was something almost imperceptible in her expression, not anger, not defeat, but clarity, the kind that comes when a situation reveals more than it intends to. And then she stepped outside, the doors closing softly behind her, leaving the showroom exactly as it had been, unchanged on the surface, but quietly marked by a decision that had already set something much larger into motion, even if no one inside realized it yet. The evening air outside felt cooler than it should have, or maybe it was just the quiet shift inside her that made everything seem sharper, clearer, as Emily walked across the parking lot without looking back, her steps steady, unhurried, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But her mind was not on the moment she had just left. It was already moving ahead, connecting pieces, evaluating what she had seen, what had been said, and more importantly, what had not been said, because silence, she knew, often revealed more than words ever could. And as she reached her car, a modest sedan parked between two oversized luxury SUVs, she paused for a second before unlocking the door, her reflection faint in the tinted window, her expression unchanged, composed, thoughtful, almost detached, as if she had just observed something rather than experienced it. And maybe that was exactly what she had done, because for Emily, moments like that were not new. They were patterns, predictable, almost routine in places where perception held more value than truth. And yet this one had been different, not in what happened, but in how it settled, the way Mark had spoken, the way the room had allowed it, the quiet agreement in the air that no one needed to question the judgment that had been made. And that was what stayed with her as she slid into the driver's seat, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel before she started the engine. Not anger, not even disappointment, but a quiet recognition of something that would not be left unresolved, not because she needed to prove anything, but because moments like that had a way of defining more than just a single interaction. They revealed the kind of place something was, and the kind of people who shaped it, and Emily understood that better than most, because she had spent years building something of her own, something that operated very differently, something where decisions were not made in seconds based on appearance, but measured carefully, deliberately, with a standard that could not be seen at a glance. And as she pulled out of the lot, the showroom lights fading in her rearview mirror, she reached for her phone, not in frustration, not in urgency, but with the calm precision of someone who already knew exactly what needed to be done, her fingers moving with quiet familiarity as she scrolled to a name that did not appear often in her recent calls, not because it was unimportant, but because it did not need to be used lightly. And for a brief moment, she simply looked at the screen, her thumb hovering, as if considering whether this moment was worth that level of response. And then, without hesitation, she pressed call, holding the phone to her ear as the line rang once, twice, before connecting, and the voice that answered was steady, composed, carrying a tone that matched her own. "Emily," he said, not surprised, just attentive, and she allowed a small pause before speaking, her voice calm, controlled, but carrying a quiet weight beneath it. "Daniel," she replied, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, the city lights beginning to glow in the distance. "I stopped by Westbridge Luxury Motors today." And there was another pause, not because she needed to find her words, but because she chose them carefully. "I think you might want to visit them tomorrow." And on the other end of the line, there was no immediate response, just a brief silence that spoke volumes. Because Daniel Carter was not a man who reacted quickly, he understood tone, timing, and intention. And in that moment, he heard all three, not in what she said, but in how she said it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more focused. "What happened?" he asked, not out of curiosity, but out of certainty that something had. And Emily exhaled softly, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. "Nothing unexpected," she answered, and that was all she needed to say, because sometimes the simplest words carried the clearest message. And as the call ended, the city stretched out before her, calm, ordinary, unchanged, unaware that by this time tomorrow, that same quiet showroom would feel very different. And somewhere deep beneath its polished surface, a single moment of careless judgment was already beginning to unfold into something far more significant than anyone inside had imagined. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity, the kind that often precedes moments no one expects but everyone remembers. And inside Westbridge Luxury Motors, the atmosphere carried its usual rhythm, polished and precise, as sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows and reflected across the marble floors, casting long, clean lines beneath rows of immaculate vehicles, each one positioned with deliberate perfection. And Mark Reynolds stood near the front desk reviewing inventory reports. On a tablet, his posture confident, his expression composed, already settled into the assumption that the day ahead would unfold like any other, predictable, controlled, and comfortably within his expectations, because nothing from the day before had lingered in his mind long enough to matter, at least not in a way he believed would return. And around him, the staff moved with quiet efficiency, greeting clients, offering coffee, guiding conversations with practiced ease, the subtle choreography of a high-end showroom operating exactly as it was designed to, until something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to be noticed by those who paid attention. A low, distant sound that did not belong to the usual flow of traffic outside. A deeper engine note, smooth and deliberate, rolling closer with a presence that did not rush and did not need to. And one by one, heads began to turn toward the glass entrance, not out of alarm, but out of instinct, because there was something about that sound that carried weight, something that suggested arrival, rather than coincidence. And as the vehicle came into view, gliding slowly into the front drive, its polished black exterior reflecting the morning light with a mirror-like finish, the subtle emblem on its grille unmistakable to anyone familiar with luxury, a Rolls-Royce, pristine, deliberate, commanding attention without asking for it. And the showroom seemed to pause, conversations softening, movements slowing, as the car came to a perfect stop just beyond the glass doors. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, not because they were told to be silent, but because the presence of something like that naturally created it. And Mark straightened slightly, his attention now fully drawn to the entrance, curiosity replacing routine, his earlier confidence shifting into something more alert, more aware, because vehicles like that did not arrive without purpose. And as the engine fell silent, the driver stepped out first, moving with practiced precision to open the rear door, and there was a stillness in the air, a collective anticipation that no one openly acknowledged but everyone felt. And then, slowly, deliberately, a polished shoe touched the pavement, followed by the measured movement of a man stepping out of the vehicle, his suit perfectly tailored, his presence calm, controlled, and unmistakably authoritative. Daniel Carter did not rush, did not glance around for approval. He simply stood for a moment beside the car, adjusting his cuff with a small, effortless motion. Before lifting his gaze toward the showroom, his expression neutral, but his eyes focused, as if he already knew exactly where he was and why he had come. And inside, Mark felt something unfamiliar begin to form. Not yet concern, not yet recognition, but the first quiet fracture in the certainty he had carried so comfortably just moments before. Because in that instant, without a single word spoken, the balance of the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it, even if they did not yet understand why. The glass doors opened with a soft, almost ceremonial glide as Daniel stepped inside, and the subtle shift in the room became undeniable. Conversations fading into cautious silence, the polished rhythm of the showroom disrupted by a presence that did not need introduction yet demanded attention, and Mark felt it immediately, the air tightening in a way he could not quite explain, his instincts urging him forward even before his thoughts had fully caught up, because this was the kind of client you did not ignore, the kind you approached with precision, with respect, with the kind of attentiveness that defined success in his world. And so he moved quickly now, smoothing his jacket, adjusting his expression into something warmer, more accommodating, his earlier dismissal of the previous day buried beneath a practiced professionalism that had served him well for years. "Good morning, sir," he said as he approached, his tone confident, welcoming, as if this moment had always belonged to him. "Welcome to Westbridge Luxury Motors. How may I assist you today?" And Daniel turned his gaze toward him, not rushed, not impressed, just measured, his eyes settling on Mark with a calm intensity that made the words feel smaller the moment they left his mouth. And for a brief second, Mark felt something falter beneath his composure, but he held his posture, waiting, expecting the usual exchange, the introduction, the interest, the beginning of a high-value conversation. But instead, Daniel spoke in a voice that was quiet, controlled, and carried far more weight than volume ever could. "My wife was here yesterday," he said, and the sentence landed with a precision that cut through the room without force, and Mark's smile froze, just slightly, his mind shifting gears as it searched for context, for memory, for anything that connected those words to something he could manage. And then, almost instantly, it surfaced, not as a clear image at first, but as a feeling, a brief, uncomfortable recognition that sharpened into clarity with unsettling speed. The simple clothes, the calm voice, the request he had dismissed without thought, and his throat tightened just enough to be noticed by himself, though he fought to keep it hidden. "I see," he replied carefully, his tone adjusting, becoming more cautious. "And what can we do for her today?" But Daniel did not respond immediately. He simply held his gaze for a moment longer, allowing the silence to stretch, not aggressively, not deliberately, but naturally, as if the answer was already understood and did not need to be rushed. And around them, the room had gone still again, the staff no longer pretending not to notice, the quiet weight of the moment settling over everyone present, because something was unfolding, something that had not been planned. And Daniel finally spoke again, his voice steady, unchanged. "She asked about a silver sedan," he said, and she was told this was not the right place for her. And the words, simple as they were, carried an undeniable clarity, a mirror held up to a moment that Mark had already tried to forget, and now it stood in front of him, undeniable, impossible to reshape. And for the first time that morning, his confidence did not return, it hesitated, fractured just enough for doubt to enter. Because this was no longer a routine interaction, this was something else entirely, something he had not prepared for. And as Daniel remained standing there, composed, unwavering, the realization began to settle, slow but certain, that the decision made the day before, the one that had felt so insignificant at the time, was now standing in front of him with consequences he could no longer control. And the room, once filled with quiet luxury, now held a different kind of silence, one that waited, watched, and understood that whatever came next would not be easily forgotten. Mark felt the weight of every eye in the room settle onto him, not in judgment yet, but in expectation, as if the entire showroom had collectively paused to see how he would respond. And for the first time since Daniel had stepped inside, the confidence that usually guided his words did not arrive on cue, instead replaced by a careful hesitation, his mind racing through possibilities. searching for a version of the situation he could still control. There may have been some misunderstanding. He began, his tone softer now, measured, as though choosing each word could reshape what had already happened. We strive to provide the highest level of service to all our clients. But even as he spoke, the sentence felt hollow, incomplete, because both men standing there knew that was not what had taken place. And Daniel did not interrupt, did not challenge him. He simply listened, his expression unchanged, his presence steady, allowing Mark to continue if he chose to, but offering no relief from the silence that followed, and that silence stretched just long enough to make the next words harder to form. If your wife felt unwelcome, I sincerely apologize, Mark added, his voice tightening, slightly at the edges, not from insincerity, but from the realization that this was no longer a routine apology. This was something heavier, something that could not be resolved with practiced phrases alone, and Daniel's gaze did not shift, his calm composure remaining intact as he finally responded, his voice quiet but unmistakably firm. She did not feel unwelcome, he said, pausing just briefly. She was told she did not belong here, and the precision of that statement left no room for interpretation, no space for softening, and Mark felt it land with a clarity that made denial impossible, his posture straightening instinctively as if trying to recover ground that was already gone. That was not our intention, he replied quickly, though even he could hear how weak it sounded against the certainty in Daniel's tone. And around them, the staff stood still, their earlier movements completely halted now, because the conversation had shifted beyond customer service into something far more revealing, something that exposed the unseen rules that governed the room. And Daniel took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance slightly, his presence filling the space without force. Intent does not change impact, he said calmly, his words measured, deliberate, and the simplicity of them made it impossible to argue. And Mark swallowed, the subtle gesture betraying the pressure building beneath his composed exterior, because this was no longer about a single interaction. It was about what that interaction represented, and for the first time, he understood that the man standing in front of him was not here to negotiate, not here to browse, but here to address something that had already been decided. And Daniel let the moment settle before continuing, his voice lowering just enough to draw the room in further. My wife came here with respect, he said, and she left without it. And there was no anger in his words, no raised voice, just a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any accusation, and Mark's response faltered before it even formed, his usual control slipping in small, almost invisible ways, because there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to reframe. The situation stood exactly as it had happened, exposed and undeniable. And as the silence returned once more, deeper now, heavier, it became clear to everyone present that whatever came next would not be about selling a car. It would be about something far more permanent, something that would define not just a moment, but the kind of place this showroom truly was. Mark's lips parted slightly as if he was about to speak again, but no words came out this time, because the room had already shifted beyond language, beyond explanation, into something far more uncomfortable, something that did not allow easy recovery. And for the first time in a long time, he felt exposed, not in the way of being attacked, but in the way of being seen clearly, without the protection of titles or polished routines. And Daniel remained still, his posture relaxed yet unyielding, his presence anchoring the moment in a way that made everything else feel secondary. And then, without raising his voice or changing his expression, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim, dark leather card holder, opening it with a smooth, practiced motion before sliding a single card forward and placing it gently on the glass counter between them, the sound barely audible, but in that silence, it carried. And Mark's eyes dropped instinctively to the card, his gaze scanning the clean lettering, the embossed name, the understated logo that did not need embellishment to be recognized. And as the meaning settled in, it did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, piece by piece, each detail connecting to the next until the full weight of it became undeniable. Daniel Carter was not simply a wealthy client. He was a name tied to investments, to ownership structures, to decisions that shaped entire networks of businesses, including As Mark now realized with a tightening in his chest, the parent group that held controlling interest in Westbridge Luxury Motors, and the air in the room shifted again, this time more sharply, more distinctly. As those close enough to see the card began to understand what it represented, whispers did not form, but awareness did, spreading quietly from one person to another. And Mark's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his shoulders stiffening, his confidence retreating into something far more cautious, far more uncertain, because this was no longer a conversation he could guide. This was a moment he had already lost control of, and Daniel closed the card holder calmly, returning it to his pocket without looking away. His voice steady as he spoke again. "I do not make decisions based on impressions," he said, his tone even, almost reflective. "I make them based on patterns," and the words hung in the air, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, one that did not need to be explained further. And Mark felt the implication settle in, the understanding that this was not about a single mistake, but about what that mistake revealed, about the culture it reflected, the standards it allowed. And for the first time, he understood that what had happened the day before was not small. It was not forgettable. It was a moment that had exposed something fundamental, and Daniel took a slow breath, his gaze shifting briefly across the showroom, taking in the space, the staff, the quiet tension that now filled every corner, before returning to Mark. "My wife chose to come here on her own," he continued, "because she believed this was a place that valued people, not appearances." And there was a pause, just long enough for the weight of that belief to settle. Yesterday proved otherwise, and the simplicity of that sentence carried more impact than any raised voice could have. And Mark lowered his gaze for a fraction of a second, the first visible sign that the reality of the situation had fully reached him, because there was no response that could undo what had already been done, no explanation that could erase the clarity of what Daniel had just laid out. And around them, the room had gone completely still, the kind of silence that does not come from instruction, but from understanding, because everyone present could feel it now, the quiet but undeniable shift in power. The realization that the moment they were witnessing was not just a confrontation, but a turning point. And as Daniel stood there, composed and unwavering, it became clear that whatever followed would not be loud, it would not be dramatic, but it would be decisive, and it would be remembered. No one moved at first, not because they were unsure what to do, but because the moment itself demanded stillness, the kind that settles in when a truth has been spoken too clearly to ignore. And Mark stood there with his hands resting lightly against the edge of the glass counter, his fingers no longer tapping, his posture no longer controlled by confidence, but by awareness. The realization that every small decision he had made the day before had now converged into something far larger than he had ever intended. And Daniel did not rush the moment. He did not press forward or escalate. He simply allowed the silence to exist, because silence, when placed correctly, often carried more authority than words ever could. And after a few seconds that felt longer than they should have, he spoke again, his voice calm, even, and precise. "I am not here to create a scene," he said, his gaze steady. "And I am not here for an apology that disappears after I walk out that door." And the distinction was subtle but unmistakable, drawing a line between performative correction and real accountability. And Mark nodded once, almost automatically, though his expression had shifted completely now, the polished ease replaced by something more grounded, more uncertain, because he understood that this was no longer about fixing a single mistake. It was about addressing what that mistake represented. And Daniel continued, his tone unchanged. "This location operates under a larger structure," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. And Mark swallowed lightly before responding. "Yes, sir." His voice quieter now, respectful in a way that was no longer performative, and Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the answer before continuing. "Then you understand that standards are not optional," he said, and there was no threat in his words, no raised edge, just a clarity that made the implication unavoidable. And somewhere behind Mark, a senior manager who had been watching from a distance finally stepped forward, his pace measured but noticeably more urgent than before, his expression carefully composed as he approached, already aware that the situation had moved beyond internal handling. "Mr. Carter," he said, offering a respectful nod. His tone professional, but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "We appreciate you bringing this to our attention." And Daniel turned his gaze toward him, acknowledging his presence with the same calm composure. "I am not bringing it to your attention," he replied evenly. "I am observing how you respond to it." And the distinction landed immediately, shifting responsibility from awareness to action, and the manager's expression tightened just slightly, the weight of that expectation settling in, because this was not about what they knew. It was about what they would choose to do now that it had been made clear, and for a moment, no one spoke again. The room holding its breath in a quiet anticipation that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with consequence. And Mark remained still, his earlier confidence now fully replaced by a recognition he could not ignore, because this was no longer about a customer interaction. It was about the kind of place he represented, the standards he upheld, and the assumptions he had allowed to guide him. And Daniel finally took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space. His presence still anchoring the room even as he shifted position. "My wife will not be returning here," he said calmly. "But what happens next will determine whether anyone else should." And the sentence settled into the space like a quiet verdict, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute in its clarity. And as the silence returned once more, deeper now, more final, it became clear that the moment had reached its turning point, not through confrontation, but through something far more powerful, the simple, undeniable exposure of truth, and the understanding that from this point forward, every action taken would define not just the outcome, but the identity of everything that place claimed to stand for. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding something too heavy for too long. And the manager standing behind Mark straightened his posture with a renewed sense of urgency, the kind that no longer came from maintaining appearances, but from understanding consequences. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, his voice steadier now, "this situation will be addressed immediately." And there was a subtle difference in his tone, not defensive, not dismissive, but deliberate, as if each word now carried weight that could not be taken back. And Daniel regarded him for a moment, his expression unchanged, measuring not the promise itself but the intention behind it, before giving a slight nod, not approval, not agreement, just acknowledgement, because what mattered was no longer what was said in that moment, but what would follow after it. And without another word, he turned, his movement calm and unhurried, the quiet authority he carried remaining intact as he walked toward the exit, the polished floor reflecting each step with a soft echo that seemed louder now in the stillness of the room. And no one stopped him, no one attempted to prolong the interaction, because there was nothing left to add. The message had already been delivered with a clarity that required no reinforcement. And as the glass doors opened once more, letting in the morning light, Daniel stepped outside, the door closing gently behind him, sealing the moment within the walls of the showroom, but leaving its impact behind. And inside, the atmosphere had changed completely, the polished ease replaced by something more grounded, more aware, as if the room itself had been forced to confront something it had long ignored. And Mark remained where he stood, his eyes fixed on the spot where Daniel had been just seconds before, his thoughts no longer scattered but focused, not on defending what had happened, but on fully understanding it, because for the first time, he could see it clearly, not as a minor interaction, not as a routine judgment, but as a decision that had revealed more about him than he had ever intended. And the manager turned toward him, his expression firm now, no longer cautious, because the time for observation had passed. "We will review everything," he said, his voice low but decisive, and Mark nodded slowly, not in resistance, not in protest, but in acceptance, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reinterpret. The truth had already settled, and around them, the staff began to move again, but not in the same way as before, their steps more measured, their attention sharper, as if the standard they operated under had just been redefined in real time. And outside, the Rolls-Royce remained for a brief moment longer before pulling away smoothly, its presence leaving as quietly as it had arrived. But the effect it had created did not fade with it, because inside that showroom, something had shifted permanently, not through force, not through spectacle, but through a single moment of quiet exposure that revealed exactly what dignity looked like when it was denied, and what it demanded when it returned. And from that day forward, the space would no longer be judged by the shine of its floors or the price of its cars, but by something far more difficult to maintain: the way it chose to see the people who walked through its doors. Because respect, once tested, does not reset easily. And that morning, everyone in that room learned that it was never something you could afford to measure at a glance.